So as a teacher, you may be asking yourself, what exactly is formative assessment and how can I use formative assessment in my classroom? So hopefully this short presentation will answer some questions about that. As you can see, formative assessment and feedback are integral parts of course design. Up at the top, you have learning goals, what your students should be able to do, what you expect students to know. Your teaching and learning activities help guide students to those learning goals, but just as equally important are feedback and assessment. And we'll talk about some different types of feedback and assessment. So Fink, who designed that model, asks, what are the important situational factors in a particular course? What should our full set of learning goals be? What kinds of feedback and assessment we should provide? And are their components connected and well integrated? So anytime you're teaching a course or designing a course, these are some of the questions you should ask yourself at the beginning. And as you can see, assessments are an integral part of course design, and they're ultimately related to learning activities we use with students and the learning goals that we have for our students. So Fink suggests that we need to determine the situational factors that will influence these aspects of course design. It's also important to determine what our learning goals should be, as well as the types of feedback and assessment we should provide for students. And then we need to determine whether these components are connected and integrated, and do they support. So the first step obviously is identifying what our learning goals are. What do we expect students to learn by completing the assignment or the assessment? What kind of skills will they be practicing? Additionally, we should also see if we're making these goals explicit to our students. That is, do they know exactly what they need to do? And if students are aware of the goals and the outcomes, they should have a better sense of the steps that are needed to attain those outcomes. So Fink cites Grant Wiggins as a proponent of this kind of educative um, assessment. This is Fink's idea versus the more traditional auditive, where he refers to it as backwards looking assessment, where we teach, we give an assessment, and then we grade, and that's it. With educative, we're doing forward looking assessment as well as self assessment for students. Um, he's not saying that testing is not important. In fact, he's saying testing is important and provides some degree of what students have learned, but it only serves one purpose: to audit knowledge that the students have remembered or learned. So it's a type of assessment, but it only focuses on the backwards looking assessment. This other kind of assessment, reviewing the educative aspects of the assessment, helps students master the learning processes and focus on the components of learning. So for Fink, this is educative assessment, and it has four components: what they should be able to do, enabling them to assess themselves, developing standards and criteria for success in the assessment, and providing feedback that is frequent, immediate, discriminating, and delivered lovingly. And that's what the fidelity stands for: frequent, immediate, um, discriminating, and delivered lovingly. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So some other things to consider. These are some other ideas that are important for assessment. That it's when you're designing assessment, it should not be a single event, but a continuous cycle. That it's part of a process, and it's an open process that students are aware of. That it promotes valid inferences. It employs multiple measures of performance. That is, you're looking at different ways to assess your students, not just a test or one particular way that's used repeatedly. And it measures what's worth learning, not just what's easy to measure. So that's another important thing to consider, that you know you're really measuring what students value or what your school values, as opposed to just measuring what's easy. And it supports every student's opportunity to learn the important skills, information, knowledge, whatever it is that you're promoting for students. It, it, it's not just a way to evaluate, but a way to support students' opportunities to learn. So some other things to think about are fair assessment practices, and these are according to Suskie, as she articulated them. So make sure that they're clearly stated learning outcomes and share them with the students. What you want students to learn shouldn't be a mystery. They're going to be more um, readily able to achieve these goals if you make them explicit to them. Match the assessment to what you teach and assess and teach what you plan to assess. So, just make sure that, whatever you're teaching is what you're assessing, and whatever you're assessing is what you're teaching. Like we said in the previous one, use multiple measures with different kinds of measures, um, so that you're giving repeated assessments throughout the course or the unit or the lesson, and you're using different kinds of measures, and teach students how to do the assessment task. That it's not something that is foreign or unfamiliar to them, but something that they have some kind of practice with. Engage and encourage your students. Don't make it impossible. Give them encouragement. Interpret assessment results appropriately. That is, when you're using any kind of assessments, make sure that you're making valid inferences and not drawing unrealistic conclusions. And then evaluate the outcomes of your assessments. So these are just some different kinds that we talk about, the formative and summative assessments. So for formative assessments, and these are the kind that are given frequently throughout, these are more of the educative assessments. They would provide timely feedback about the performance or attainment of goals. They tend to be interactive, whether it's among students or between you and the student. They also tend to be low stakes. That is, they don't count readily towards a goal, towards a grade, but rather they are used as a means of providing feedback. They're administered continuously. Again, they're given throughout the semester of the course, and one of the goals of formative assessments are that they foster lifelong learning. So that and again, it's argued that this is the greatest impact on learning and achievement, and it's a lot of times it's a major goal of courses or teachers. They want their students to become lifelong learners. For summative assessment, they're focused more on achievement. They provide grades as opposed to feedback or information about performance. They tend to be high stakes, and they're administered at intervals. So think about like a midterm or a final or an end of unit test, and they're usually standardized or formalized. Um, so that in a sense they're not adaptive to each student, but rather they're one kind of like a one size fits all. So some things to think about, they're obviously value to summative assessments. What can they tell us? Um, how could you use them in your class? What is the value of formative assessments? Can they tell us about your class? And then you should think about how you currently incorporate both types of assessments in your class. I know it says discuss these with the small group, but for right now, you should just think about the value of these different types of assessments, what they can tell us, and how either you do incorporate them currently or how you plan to incorporate them in your class.